She was 22 and newly homeless in every way that mattered. No living parents, no dowry, no marriage prospect, no letter of character worth the paper it was written on, just a small leather-bound book of her mother's recipes and 11 shillings and 4 pence knotted into the corner of a handkerchief. And with that handkerchief in her pocket, she took the coach to Brackenlee, where a duke with too much land and too little conscience had agreed to house her only if she would sort the swollen ledgers and mildewed papers of a water-ruined library nobody else wished to touch. But what nobody knew, not the duke, not his steward, not the solicitor who arranged her passage, was that inside one of those ruined volumes there lay a single loose page that would eventually undo the man who had signed her in as a favor and forgotten her by supper. Settle in for this one, and if you would, let us know in the comments where in the world you are listening from, and subscribe so you can stay with Charlotte to the end. Charlotte Foster had been born in the last week of a hard winter in a market town in the north of Warwickshire, the only surviving child of a country curate and a woman who had once been governess to the daughters of a mill owner and had never quite forgiven the world for taking her out of that house and putting her into a damp parsonage with a leaking scullery. Her father was a mild, distracted man who preached with real feeling on Sundays and forgot his umbrella every other day of the week, and her mother was neat, exact, and quietly bitter, and both of them died within the same summer when Charlotte was 17. First, the mother of a fever that ran through the parish in July, and then the father, who never really recovered from burying his wife and slipped away by Michaelmas with what the doctor called a weakness of the heart and what the housekeeper called simple grief. The living reverted to the diocese. The furniture was sold to cover a debt at the coal merchants, and Charlotte, who had until that August believed she would keep house for her father into a mild and useful spinsterhood, discovered that a curate's daughter with no fortune and no near kin is a small, blowing thing in the eyes of the parish council. She had been saved then by Mrs. Peveril, the widow of a schoolmaster who had lived 3 doors down from the parsonage, and who took Charlotte into her narrow upstairs room without any speech about charity, only a nod and the observation that the girl would need to earn her keep. Mrs. Peveril was 61 and lean and rheumatic, with iron-colored hair pinned back so tightly that her forehead shone, and she made her living copying letters and keeping small tradesmen's accounts, and she saw within a week of Charlotte's arrival that the girl had a neat, patient hand and the sort of memory for figures that most men of business would have paid a clerk 5 shillings a week to possess. So Mrs. Peveril taught her, evening by evening at the kitchen table by a single tallow candle, how to keep a double column, how to reconcile a ledger against a stack of receipts, how to read a mortgage indenture without flinching at the Latin, how to catch a false total by the shape of the ink rather than the sum, and how to hold her face still while a man in a good coat lied about a bill. She taught her, too, that a woman who could read a document better than the man who wrote it was never, in the end, without a livelihood, though she might for a long stretch of her life be without comfort. The beloved object, the one Charlotte carried with her everywhere and would carry into Brackenlee, knotted at the top of her small carpet bag, was her mother's recipe book, a slim leather volume with a cracked green spine and pages foxed at the edges, in which her mother had written out, in the fine sloped hand of a former governess, not only the receipts for gingerbread and dark plum cake and beef tea for the sick, but also, in the margins and on the end papers, small remarks in pencil about the weather on the day a thing was baked, about Charlotte at 4 sitting on the flour bin, about the price of eggs in the year of the bad harvest, and, on the last page, a line written 6 months before her death that read, "For my daughter Charlotte, who has more sense than her mother and must be trusted to use it." Charlotte had read that line so often the pencil had grown faint under her thumb. She lived with Mrs. Peveril for 4 years and 8 months, and in that time she copied documents for a solicitor in the neighboring town, kept the books for a milliner and a corn factor, and once, memorably, caught a discrepancy of £9 7 shillings in the parish poor rate that no one else had troubled to look for, which earned her a nod from the churchwarden and a lasting suspicion from the overseer whose thumb had been on the scale. Then in the March of her 22nd year, Mrs. Peveril went to bed with what she called a small cough, and did not wake. and her tiny house, which she had rented, was cleared within the fortnight by the landlord's son, and Charlotte was again a small, blowing thing, only older, and this time with a reference letter written in Mrs. Peveril's own hand and left in the recipe book against exactly such a day. It was that letter, passed through the hands of the old solicitor who had employed her, that eventually reached the desk of a steward acting for the Duke of Marle at Bracken-Lee, who needed, for reasons he had not been asked to examine, a quiet young woman with a good hand and no family behind her to make trouble. The letter came for her on a Tuesday, delivered to the back door of the milliner's shop where she was still, out of the churchwarden's charity, allowed to sit at the counting desk in the mornings. It was addressed to Miss Charlotte Foster, care of Mr. Ainsworth, solicitor, and it was sealed in dark wax with a stag's head impressed into it, and Charlotte carried it up the narrow stair to the room she had been permitted to sleep in for a fortnight above the shop, and she read it standing by the window because there was no chair. The steward, a Mr. Barrow, wrote in a round, even hand that His Grace the Duke of Marle had need of a young woman capable of steady clerical work, that she would be lodged and fed at Bracken-Lee in Herefordshire, that her particular task would be the inventory and ordering of a library damaged by water some years earlier, and that her wage would be £12 the year, paid quarterly, less a deduction for candles and washing. She was to present herself at the estate on the 12th of April. The letter did not ask whether she wished to come. It did not need to. Charlotte laid the letter on the sill and looked at the roofs of the town, at the wet slates and the leaning chimneys and the crow on the gable of the corn exchange. And she understood, with the practical calm that had come to stand in her for grief, that she was being sent. Mr. Ainsworth, when she called at his chambers that afternoon, did not look up from his blotter. He said only that she had been fortunate, that a great house was a great house, and that a girl with no people about her did well to go where she was wanted. He counted out 3 shillings against wages owed. He wished her, without warmth, a safe journey. In the street outside, she stood a moment with the coins in her palm, and then knotted them into the same handkerchief that already held the 8 shillings and 4pence she had saved out of Mrs. Peveril's small effects, and she went back to the room above the milliner's and began to pack. There was little to pack. She had 2 day dresses of dark wool, a Sunday dress of gray stuff with a black ribbon at the throat, a shawl of Mrs. Peveril's that smelled still of the peppermint drops the old woman had kept in her pocket, 2 shifts, 3 pairs of stockings darned at the heel, a pair of ankle boots she was already wearing, a comb, a hairbrush with a loose bristle, a needle case, a small tin of pins, a testament that had been her father's with his name written on the fly-leaf in a young man's hand, and the recipe book, which she set at the top of the carpet-bag with the reference letter folded inside it and Mr. Barrow's letter folded beside that. The milliner's wife, whose name was Mrs. Denny, brought up a slice of cold ham wrapped in paper and a hard-boiled egg and a piece of gingerbread, and said Charlotte was to eat these on the coach and not let the boys at the inns cheat her over hot water, and Charlotte thanked her without crying because she had learnt from Mrs. Peveril that a woman who cries at kindness is thought soft and paid less, and she took the food and put it in the bag with the rest. She left the town on the Wednesday morning before it was light. The lamp above the coach-yard was still burning, and the ostler was blowing on his hands, and the mud in the yard had frozen in ridges under the wheels. She paid 4 shillings and 6pence for an outside seat as far as Worcester, and she climbed up in the dark and settled her carpet-bag between her feet, with the strap of it wound once about her ankle, because Mrs. Peveril had told her long ago that thieves at coach inns knew a country girl by her bag before they knew her by her face. The coach went out through the toll gate at 6:30, and Charlotte watched the town go by, piece by piece in the graying light, the market cross, the closed shutters of the corn exchange, the churchyard wall where her father was buried, the row of 3 houses where Mrs. Peveril had lived and died, and then the last cottages, and then the hedgerows, and then the open country, which had a hard silver frost on it, and a mist lying in the low fields like standing water. She did not turn her head to look back. She sat forward on the bench with her hands inside her shawl and her feet close on the bag, and she watched the road come at her out of the pale morning. They changed horses at Alcester and again at Evesham. and by the time they came down into the vale below Breeden Hill, the frost had gone off the fields, and the sky had lowered, and it had begun to rain, a thin cold rain that soaked through the shawl at the shoulders first, and then along the back. Charlotte pulled the shawl closer and ate the ham and the egg somewhere past Pershore, and saved the gingerbread. At Worcester, she waited 2 hours in the yard of the hop pole for the Hereford coach, standing under the arch out of the wet, and she drank a cup of tea for a penny and warmed her hands round it, and listened to 2 drovers argue about the price of store cattle. And she thought, without self-pity, that no one in that yard knew her name or would remember her face by evening, and that this was, on the whole, a useful kind of freedom. The Hereford coach was smaller and older, and its springs were poor, and she took an inside seat this time, because the rain had settled into a steady dark fall, and she had begun to shiver in a way she did not like. Her fellow passengers were a stout clergyman who slept, a woman with a basket of laying hens under a cloth, and a young man in a black coat who read a folded newspaper and did not look at her. The road ran west, through country she did not know, orchards bare of leaf, red earth turned by the plow, small stone villages set close to their churches, and always in the distance the long soft line of the Malvern Hills going blue in the rain. She watched it all with the careful attention Mrs. Peveril had taught her to give to any place she had not yet learnt, because a person who noticed the shape of a country could not so easily be lost in it. It was near dark when the coach set her down at a crossroads 3 miles short of the village of Brackenlee, where a carter in a tarred coat was waiting with a lantern and a mule and a covered cart, sent, he said, by Mr. Barrow, and he took her bag without a word, and helped her up under the canvas, and the cart went on into the wet lanes between hedges so high she could not see over them, and the lantern swung, and the mule's hooves sounded soft on the mud, and Charlotte, tired at last past the edge of thinking, held her carpet-bag on her knees, and felt the shape of the recipe book through the canvas of it, and waited to see the house that was to be, for a while at least, her place in the world. The house came on her out of the wet dark all at once, not by any grand approach, but by a turn of the lane and the sudden lift of the lantern against a long wall of local red sandstone streaked black with rain. Brackenlee stood in a shallow park with elms grown ragged for want of a woodman, and a carriage drive rutted where no carriage had passed in some months, and the carter took her not to the great door under its pediment, but around by a service track to a side entrance where a woman in a grey stuff dress and a white cap stood waiting under an iron lamp. This was Mrs. Ridley, the housekeeper, aged about 50, thin, careful about the mouth, and she took Charlotte in without ceremony, gave her hot water and bread and butter in a small servant's parlor, and led her up 2 flights of a back stair to a room in the north attic with a sloping ceiling, a narrow iron bed, a deal washstand, 1 rush chair, a cold grate, and a small window looking out over stable roofs to a black line of trees. Charlotte was told her wages had been noted, that she would begin at 8 the next morning, that the west wing was closed by His Grace's order, and she was not to speak of what she saw there to the other servants, and that Mr. Barrow would meet her at the library door at that hour. Then Mrs. Ridley wished her a good night in a voice that had wished many things without much meaning them, and shut the door, and Charlotte set the recipe book on the washstand and slept in her stockings under her shawl. At 8 the next morning, Mr. Barrow, a man of 60 in a black frock coat and steel spectacles, unlocked a door at the end of a long stone corridor in the west wing and let her into the library. It was a room 40 feet by 22, with 3 tall windows shuttered inside, a plaster ceiling once painted pale blue and now bloomed with brown stains the shape of continents, and oak shelves running floor to cornice on 3 walls. 6 years earlier, Mr. Barrow said, without expression, a lead cistern in the roof above had burst in a hard frost and let a slow flood down through the plaster for 4 days before it was discovered, and the room had never since been used. The carpet, a turkey pattern in reds and blues, had rotted along the west wall into a black felt that smelled of iron and mushroom. The shelves nearest the window had swelled and sprung their joints, and the books, some 3,000 volumes by Mr. Barrow's estimate, stood in rows fused at their spines, foxed to the boards, sprouted here and there with pale gray fur along their top edges. A long mahogany table down the center of the room bore stacked ledgers, bundles of estate papers tied in pink tape gone to lavender, and one japanned tin box without a lid. There was a small coal fire laid in the marble grate, but not yet lit, a brass scuttle half full, a stool, a stepladder with a mended tread, and by the door a deal desk fitted for her with an inkstand, a ream of paper, a bundle of quills, a penknife, and a bound quarto of ruled foolscap in which she was to enter each volume by author, title, date, and condition. Her instruction, Mr. Barrow said, was to be thorough and slow, and to trouble no one. His Grace expected the work to occupy her a full 12-month and possibly 2. He said this without looking at her, locked a second door at the far end that she noticed only because he locked it, and left her with the key to the corridor. Charlotte lit the fire, took off her shawl and folded it on the stool, opened the shutters of the middle window to a gray, wet morning over a walled kitchen garden gone to nettles, and set to work. She began at the shelf nearest the door because it was the least ruined, and she made her first entries in a small, even hand. Sermons of Dr. South, 3 volumes, calf, joints cracked, foxed but sound. Blackstone's Commentaries, 4 volumes, boards warped, text legible. A Book of Common Prayer of 1762, with the covers gone and the sewing loose. She worked through the morning without speaking. Went down at noon to a cold dinner of bread and cheese in the servants' hall where no one asked her name, and came back to the library and worked until the light failed. So the days went for 11 weeks. Charlotte learned the room as she had learned the town, by careful attention. She learned which shelves had taken the worst of the water and which stood dry. She learned to lift a swollen book with both hands flat under it, because the spines had lost their grip on the boards. She learned to slit the fused pages with the penknife where a title page hid inside. She learned that the ledgers on the mahogany table were estate accounts for the years from 1841 to 1858, kept by a former steward whose hand was less round than Mr. Barrow's, and whose totals she found, in 3 places, did not agree with themselves by sums of £2, of £7 4, and of £11 6. She noted these in a separate small book she kept in her apron pocket and said nothing. Mrs. Peveril had taught her to say nothing until she knew what a thing was. It was on a wet Thursday in late June, in her 12th week at the work, that Charlotte took down from the west wall a folio volume bound in dark calf and marked on the spine in faded gilt terrier of the Manor of Brackenlee, 1802. The book had swelled to nearly twice its proper thickness, and the front board had parted from the text block along a broken hinge. Charlotte carried it to the table, laid it on a folded cloth, and eased the board back to see whether the end papers could be saved. Between the marbled paste down and the board itself, where the flood had loosened the paste, a single folded page had been pressed flat and forgotten. It was thicker than the surrounding paper, a laid sheet with a crown watermark, and when Charlotte drew it out with the tip of the penknife and unfolded it upon the cloth, she saw at once that it did not belong to the terrier at all. It was a fair copy, in a clerk's careful hand, of an agreement dated the 9th of May, 1839, between the late Duke of Marle, grandfather of the present Duke, and the freeholders of a hamlet called Nether Pion on the eastern edge of the estate, concerning the enclosure of a stretch of common land of about 84 acres running down to the Frome. By the terms of the agreement, the freeholders surrendered their common rights in exchange for a yearly payment of £32 in perpetuity to be divided among 7 named households, and for the grant in fee simple of a strip of meadow of 4 acres along the river to be held by the parish as glebe for the poor. The document was signed by the old Duke, witnessed by 2 solicitors of Hereford whose names Charlotte did not know, and stamped with the impressed revenue mark of that year. Pinned to the corner with a rusted pin was a smaller slip, in a different and shakier hand, which read, "This is the true agreement. The copy enrolled at the Herefordshire Assizes in 1841 differs and is false. The payments have not been made since 1843, and the meadow was taken back by His Grace in 1847 under a false surrender. Whoever finds this, I could not undo it in my lifetime. I am James Alcott, steward to this house 41 years, and I put this here in the terrier which no one reads, and I hope it finds an honest hand. God forgive me my part." Charlotte sat down on the stool by the fire with the 2 papers in her lap, and did not move for a long while. When she moved carefully. She took a clean sheet of foolscap from the ream on her desk and copied both papers out in her own round hand, letter for letter, and she copied the terrier's title page and its shelf mark as well, so that the provenance of the find could be shown. She folded the original page and the pinned slip together in a square of oiled paper she cut from the lining of the japanned tin box, and she tied the packet with a length of the pink tape faded to lavender. Then she went on with the shelf she had begun that morning and entered 4 more volumes into the quarto, because a room in which nothing had changed was a room no one would look into. That evening, in her attic under the sloping ceiling, she wrote a short, careful letter, not to Mr. Barrow, and not to the Duke, but to Mr. Ainsworth, solicitor, at his chambers in the market town she had come from, asking whether he could give her the name of an honest attorney in Hereford who was not of the Duke's business, and who understood old enclosures. She sealed the letter with a wafer and posted it herself the next morning at the receiving house in the village, walking down through the wet lanes on her half-day, her recipe book left on the washstand, and 11 shillings and 4 pence still knotted in the handkerchief in her pocket. Mr. Ainsworth's answer came in 9 days. He named a Mr. Whitcomb of Broad Street, Hereford, a man of 64, sober, a churchwarden, and no friend to the great houses. Charlotte wrote to Mr. Whitcomb the same evening, enclosed her own copy of the 2 papers, described where the original lay, asked what a person in her position ought to do, and signed her full name. She kept the original packet in the lining of her carpet-bag under the recipe book, because Mrs. Peveril had taught her that a paper is safest where a searcher expects only clothing. Mr. Whitcomb drove out from Hereford on the following Tuesday in a plain gig with a bay pony, calling not at the great door but at the receiving house in the village on the pretext of a tithe matter. Charlotte met him there in the parlor behind the shop of Mr. Perks the grocer, a widower of 57 who let his back room for a shilling and asked no questions. Mr. Whitcomb read the copies twice, looked at Charlotte over his steel spectacles, and said only, "Bring me the original on Saturday. Tell no one." On Saturday she brought it, wrapped in the oiled paper inside the recipe book inside the carpet bag, and Mr. Whitcomb took it away in a leather case locked with a small brass key. The work then went forward slowly and by ordinary means. Mr. Whitcomb searched the rolls at the assizes and found the false enrollment of 1841, and he found also the surrender of the meadow in 1847, signed with a mark, by a man who had been dead 6 years by that date. He engaged Mr. Hollis, a land agent of 48, quiet, thorough, once employed by the diocese, to walk the 84 acres and measure the strip of meadow along the Frome, and Mr. Hollis returned with a plan drawn on linen and a list of the 7 households of Nether Pion still traceable by name: Bewley, Randall, Thorpe, Pritchard, Merriman, Keene, and Watts, and of the descendants now living on the land. Charlotte, at Mr. Whitcomb's instruction, kept to her library, entered volumes into the quarto, and said nothing at all. She entered in those weeks 142 further titles, and she found in the estate ledgers on the mahogany table 2 more small discrepancies, which she copied into the small book in her apron pocket against a day when they might be asked for. At the end of August, Mr. Whitcomb called at Brackenlee in the proper manner by the front drive, with a clerk beside him and a sealed bundle of documents on his knee. He was received in the small library off the hall, not the ruined one, and he laid the matter out to the Duke in 20 minutes of level speech: the true agreement of 1839, the false enrollment of 1841, the arrears of the yearly payment now standing at £480 with interest, the wrongful reoccupation of the 4-acre meadow, and the sworn statement of Mr. Hollis as to the ground. The Duke, a heavy man of 46, said very little. Mr. Whitcomb left a copy of the papers and drove away. Within a fortnight, the tenants of Nether Pion knew that a matter was afoot, because a land agent had walked their strip along the Frome with a chain and a boy, and because Mr. Hollis had called on each of the 7 houses in turn, sat in each kitchen, drunk the tea offered, and taken down what the old people remembered. Mrs. Bewley, aged 79, remembered her father speaking of the 32 pounds and the year it had stopped. Mr. Randall, aged 63, a wheelwright, remembered the meadow being fenced against them when he was a boy of 22. Mr. Thorpe, a hedger of 51, brought out from a chest a letter of his grandfather's in which the old Duke was named, and the promise of the glebe was written down. The tenants came together in the vestry of the parish church at Netherpyon on a Thursday evening, the vicar, Mr. Ridpath, aged 58, sitting with them, and they resolved by 7 signatures and 1 mark to instruct Mr. Whitcomb jointly and to bear the costs by subscription of a shilling in the pound of their rents until the matter was settled. They asked through Mr. Ridpath that Miss Foster be present, since it was by her hand the paper had been brought out, and Charlotte walked the 4 miles from Brackenlee on her next half-day and sat on a rush-bottomed chair by the vestry stove, while the 7 heads of household thanked her by nodding once, each in turn, and by nothing else, which was the country manner. Mrs. Bewley took Charlotte home to her cottage afterward, and gave her a bowl of pea soup and a slice of bread and dripping, and put into her hand, as she left, a small twist of dried mint from her garden for the tea in the attic. Mr. Randall the wheelwright sent word to Brackenlee the following week that if Miss Foster required a cart at any hour for any purpose, he would send his son with the mare, and no charge. Mr. Perks the grocer refused her penny for the tea she drank in his back parlor. On the Saturdays she now came down to meet Mr. Whitcomb's clerk, and Mrs. Perks, aged 49 and childless, took to putting a piece of seed cake beside the cup without remark. Inside the house, the change came more slowly and by different signs. Mrs. Ridley, the housekeeper, who had for 11 weeks addressed Charlotte as girl or you, began in the 12th week to say Miss Foster at the door of the servants' hall, and set a place for her at the upper end of the table where the lady's maid had used to sit before the lady's maid was let go. The under-housemaid, Annie Coles, aged 19, brought a scuttle of coal to the library door in the mornings without being asked, and lit the fire before Charlotte came down, and stood a moment at the window, looking out at the nettled kitchen garden, and said once, "It is a shame, miss, what was done." Charlotte thanked her and said nothing more, because a house is a house of ears. Mr. Barrow the steward went about his ordinary business with his ordinary face, but he no longer locked the second door at the far end of the ruined library, and he no longer said that the work was to occupy her a full 12-month, and possibly 2. He said instead, when he passed her at her desk, "Good morning, Miss Foster," and once, in September, he set down beside her inkstand a small brass paperweight in the shape of an acorn and walked out without speaking. And Charlotte understood it for what it was, which was an old man setting down a small thing on the side of the truth. In the village of Brackenlee, the news traveled in the ordinary way, by the well and the churchyard path and the counter of Mr. Perks's shop, and Charlotte's name traveled with it. Children, when she passed on the lane, said "Good day, miss." The blacksmith, Mr. Salter, aged 42, mended the loose bristle in her hairbrush without charge when she brought it in on a Saturday, and shod the wheelwright's mare on the day Mr. Randall's son came with the cart. The vicar of the parish, Mr. Ridpath, called at the back door of Brackenlee on a Wednesday afternoon and asked Mrs. Ridley whether Miss Foster might be permitted to take her Sundays at Netherpyon Church, and Mrs. Ridley, after a short pause, said that she might. Charlotte walked the 4 miles each Sunday in her gray stuff dress with the black ribbon at the throat, sat in a pew lent her by Mrs. Bewley, and walked back in the afternoon by the strip of meadow along the Frome, which by October had been quietly refenced by Mr. Randall and 2 of his neighbors out of oak posts and hazel rails, and given back, in fact if not yet in law, to the parish. She stood at the river's edge one Sunday and watched 3 of the parish cows put onto the meadow for the first time in 22 years, and she did not cry, because Mrs. Peveril had taught her that a woman who cries at kindness is thought soft. The library also began to change. Charlotte had by November entered 912 volumes into the quarto. Mr. Whitcomb, acting now for the tenants, and by a separate retainer paid out of the first quarter's arrears, For Charlotte herself, in the small matter of her wages, obtained from the Duke a written acknowledgment that Miss Foster's engagement was to continue at £15 the year, paid quarterly, without deduction, and that she was to have the use of a small parlor on the ground floor of the west wing with a fire kept, in which she might receive persons upon the business of the estate papers. Charlotte moved her inkstand and the quarto and the acorn paperweight down to the parlor in the second week of November, and Annie Coles carried down the shawl of Mrs. Peveril's and hung it on the peg behind the door. The parlor was not a grand room. It was 14 feet by 12, with a single sash window looking onto the walled kitchen garden that Mr. Randall's son had begun to clear of nettles on Saturdays for the price of his dinner, and it had a small marble grate, a turkey rug worn thin but sound, a mahogany table brought down from the ruined library and rubbed with beeswax by Annie Coles, 2 chairs of caned seat, and a bookcase in which Charlotte kept the quarto, the small book from her apron pocket, a folder of Mr. Hollis's linen plans, and a copy of the true agreement of 1839 that Mr. Whitcomb had had engrossed for her upon vellum. On a Friday afternoon in the middle of December, with the fire drawing well and a thin snow beginning outside, Charlotte sat at the table and set out beside her inkstand 2 objects. The first was her mother's recipe book, the slim leather volume with the cracked green spine and the foxed pages, with Mrs. Peveril's reference letter still folded inside the back cover. The second was the small twist of dried mint that Mrs. Bewley had put into her hand in her cottage kitchen after the vestry meeting, now tied with a thread and kept in a saucer. She looked at them a long while. She thought of her mother's hand on the flour bin, and of Mrs. Peveril's tallow candle, and of Mr. James Alcott, steward of this house 41 years, who had put a folded page into a terrier no one read, and had hoped, in a shaky hand, that it might find an honest one. She thought of the Duke, who had given her the water-ruined library to waste her time, and of Mr. Barrow, who had brought her the brass acorn without speaking, and of Annie Coles, who lit her fire in the mornings, and of the 3 parish cows on the meadow. She opened the recipe book at the last written page and read again the line her mother had put there 6 months before her death, that the book was for Charlotte and that she must be trusted to use it. Charlotte closed the book, laid her hand flat upon its cover, and understood that she had been trusted by 3 people she could name and 1 she could not, and that the trust had held. She took up her pen and entered into the quarto the 913th volume, a herbal of 1721 with the boards gone and the text sound. Charlotte Foster was 22 and had been cast out with a recipe book and 11 shillings and 4pence tied in a handkerchief, and she had been sent to a water-ruined library in a shuttered wing of a neglected country estate to keep her quiet and out of notice. It was the best 11 shillings and 4pence she ever carried through a door. If this story has kept you company for a little while, stay close and subscribe, and leave a word below to say where you are listening from tonight, whether it is a kitchen after supper or a long drive or a quiet hour before sleep. And before you go, sit with this a moment. Who in your own life put a folded page into a book no one read, trusting that an honest hand would one day find it? And what have you carried in your pocket, tied in a handkerchief that turned out to be worth more than anyone around you knew?